Standing, and I know it's hard for some of you. The book of Joshua, chapter 3. Book of Joshua, chapter 3. We're going to try to get through this. Amen. Jay and company tried to mess us up today. Amen. Joshua, chapter 3. Joshua, chapter 3. And we want to reading to your hearing verses 15 through 17 from the NIV. Joshua, chapter 3. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, still. I'm serious. Say, still. My best year ever. Come on, look at him and say, I could tell. Amen. Look at your neighbor and say, you all prospering in things. Amen. Amen. Come on, look at him and say, you don't have to brag. Don't brag. Don't brag. Look at your neighbor and say, because it's my best year too. It's my best year. Amen. 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 Joshua 3, verse 15 reads, now the Jordan is at flood stage during all harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the sea of the Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. And so the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, this year is the year you need to get your feet wet. Come on, look at him and say, no, seriously, get your feet wet. You may be seated. The following letter was found on a baking powder can wired to the handle of an old pump that offered the last hope of clean drinking water. The last hope of clean water for a very long and seldom used desert trail. And the letter said, this pump is functional as of June 1932. I put a new washer into it and it ought to last 5 years, but the washer dries out and the pump has to be primed. Under the white rock, I buried a bottle of water out of the sun and cork end up. And there's enough water in it to prime this pump, but not if you drink some water first. Pour about 1/4 and let it soak to wet the leather, and then pour in the rest at medium speed and begin to pump. You'll get water. The well will never run dry. Have faith. When you get watered up, fill the bottle and put it back like you found it for the next feller. Signed, sincerely, Desert Pete. P.S. Don't go drinking up all the water first. Prime the pump, and you can have all the water you want. Now, if you were a weary traveler, if you were traveling down that parched desert trail with that, you found that letter and your canteen had run bone dry, would you trust those words from Desert Pete? For all you know, he could have been a lunatic. For all you know, it could have been a mad hoax. There are no guarantees that what the letter says is true. And what would motivate you to prime the pump with the water in the bottle? You're thirsty, but you're smart. This is the 11 o'clock service. And you understand the fact that old pumps have to be primed. So it's a gamble. It's a risk. It's an adventure. What would you do? Tap your neighbor and say, you know you drink that water. This story illustrates an important principle that I want to call the before principle. That the lonely traveler had to prime the pump before any water flowed. The before principle manifests itself in every area of life. There are battles before victory. There are struggles before celebrations. There are steps before arrivals. There is practice before perfection. There is preparation before completion. There is matriculation before graduation. And over in Scripture, this pattern is repeated. The Israelites had to march to the Red Sea before God parted it. Naaman had to wash 7 times in the Jordan before God cleansed him from leprosy. Gideon had to reduce his army from 32,000 to 300 before God delivered them from the Midianites. The fish and the loaves had to be given up by the lad to Jesus before Jesus could multiply them to feed the multitudes. Peter had to obey Jesus, step out of the boat before he could walk out on the water. Nowhere was this principle of before more evident than when Joshua was preparing to lead the Hebrews into the promised land. After 400 years of slavery and another 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they were perched on the banks of the Jordan, ready to cross over. They prayed, cried, complained, and whined their way to this challenging and yet defining moment. The Hebrew people had never crossed the Jordan. Even when the spies had been sent out to do reconnaissance by Moses in that land, they had never crossed. But the first command of God to Joshua as he succeeds Moses was to arise, you and all these people, and cross over the Jordan. No small task, because when you read the text, as they approached this famous river that formed a barrier between them and their longed for real estate, the river was set at flood stage. The gentle Jordan had now become a raging river, overflowing its banks. There's no low water crossing in sight. The river had now grown to a mile wide. It was 150 miles long, a mile wide, which meant they could not go around it. There were no bridges. That meant they could not go over it. The way was blocked. The river was defiantly impassable. And more often than not, that's how our rivers look when we face them in our lives. Can I get some witnesses here? Currents reached up to 40 miles an hour when the Jordan floods, and what was even more telling was that the terrain was surrounded with tangled brush and dense growth. That was the sight that greeted the people of God, following the instructions of God from the servant of God. And so the people pitched their tents on the eastern edge of the river, and for 3 days they waited, watching the water and the waves carrying debris and trunks of trees. For 3 days they slept, or at least they tried to sleep, listening to the endless rush of the water in the dark. For 3 days the passing torrent eroded all of their confidence. The waiting pounded the reality in their minds. You could even hear the doubts being whispered in the night fires. We're not gonna make it, are we? An insistent no began to form in their hearts as they listened to the rush and the roar of the water, because 3 days is plenty of time to ask plenty of questions. How are we gonna get across? Will somebody give us a boat? Will somebody build a bridge? Will everybody get to go? How deep is it? How cold is it? Is it slippery? What about the frail? What about the sick? What about the infirm? What about the elderly? What about the children? Most of all, how can a nation of people cross a flooded, bridgeless, boatless water? It's easy perhaps to identify right now in this crowd, for us to identify with the emotion and the thoughts of Israel, because so many of them have faced, so many of us have faced and are facing our own personal Jordan right now. I don't know who I'm talking to, but perhaps you're facing a Jordan that feels so permanent and powerful that there are times that you are tempted not to even try to get across, because the Jordan in this text represents the boundary between our problem and our promise. If you go with me, I think I can preach here. It's a boundary between where I've always been and where I've always wanted to be. And it's easy to identify, because at Jordan our lives feel stalled, stuck, stale and stagnant as though we are on the wrong side of the promises of God. We've heard about the abundant life, but can't seem to escape the reach of the wilderness. And it's not just individuals. It's churches and families and communities and even nations that feel that way sometimes, stalemated by the promise of something great with God, but blocked by all kinds of barriers. I came today and I was excited to preach this to you and tell you, all of you, my friends, my church family, never forget that the God we serve can turn no way into a highway. Question that loomed over Israel and that looms over our lives is, will we walk by sight or will we determine to move in faith? Do we really believe that God can handle an impossible situation? I think I'm talking to somebody here. Because Joshua 3 goes on to tell us something that will be echoed throughout the scripture, and it is simply this, that what is impossible with people is completely possible with God. Oh, y'all trying to help, y'all trying to finish my sermon. That God, some of y'all must have been watching the video on Facebook or something, because y'all finishing my message already. That God is about to reveal to them the steps that have to be taken in every life to move us from grounded to grateful, and from being marooned in the past to marveling at God's future. In this narrative, the words crossing over are mentioned 21 times, because this is a point of transition. Say transition. You ought not be stuck in your Christian life. You ought to get to a place where you feel that God is about to transition you, that no matter how blessed you have been, it ain't compared to how blessed you will be. No matter how, no matter what your experience was when you got saved, it ain't nothing compared to the experience that you're going to have since you've been saved. There's a transition. There's a point of transition. The crossing over, now watch this, requires a new faith experience. That when you are at the place of transition, whatever worked to get you saved now is not going to work while you're saved. Okay, y'all not here. Okay, let me put it this way. The before principle needs to be applied, and that's what's happening here. In order for them to occupy the new land, the before principle must be applied. But God has something that he wants to give them, and the experiences and the decisions that reported in this chapter of the text were major breakthroughs for them. But watch this, there's a whole new generation that has sprung up since then. And with this new generation, they've got to learn that victory in life depends solely on the power of God. Okay, yeah, okay, let me explain. Because all of us who are in this room right now, can I be prophetic? Can I just share with you? Let me speak a word of prophecy. We are standing on the brink of a God-sized future. And since we are standing on that brink, you got to consider that there are going to be obstacles that may hinder us. And it may feel sometimes as if though what we are facing is impossible. But watch this, an impossible crossing is no match for the God of the uncrossable. God knows how to take you from trapped to triumphant. God knows how to take you from setback to set up. So how do we do it, Pastor? How can we get there? I got 3 quick things I'm going to leave with you, and we're going to go home. The first thing is you got to understand that the obstacle is the opportunity. Somebody ought to shout right there, Pastor. You talking to me. One obstacle after the next. Listen, the Jordan was a huge obstacle blocking their path to the place of promise. My place of promise is there, but between me and my promise is a Jordan. So understand this. It is the obstacle that's blocking their path, but it's also a definitive opportunity for God to show up, show out, and show off. Face to face with this raging and impassable river, they were so close, but yet so far away. They were confronted with a test of faith, and to pass it, the before principle needs to be applied. The miracle they needed resembled the miracle their parents had experienced. The passing of the Red Sea. No one in the present except Caleb and Joshua had experienced that move of God. Israel was now a new generation that's removed from their Red Sea experience. This generation had only heard about the 10 plagues that broke the back of Egypt. They had only heard about the hurried escape from Pharaoh and his armies. They had only heard about the exodus through the Red Sea on dry ground. And it's one thing to hear about the power of God, but it's another thing to know and experience the power of God for yourself. God would do for them what God had done for their parents, but there was a requirement. They first had to prime the pump. Can I get somebody who will help me here? They would know and experience the power of God, but first they had to take a step. They had to see this difficult obstacle as a divine opportunity for something incredible to take place. Okay, I got to do like I did the first service. They had to see that this difficult obstacle was nothing more than a divine opportunity for something incredible to take place. They had to see that this difficult obstacle was nothing more than a divine opportunity for something incredible. I wish I had about 10 more people who could catch this. There was a difficult obstacle that was set up for them to bring them a divine opportunity for something incredible to take place. Let me say it one more way. I got some more ways I can remix this. Okay, here it is. What we label as a mess, God labels as a miracle. Okay, I still miss some people in the back. Here it is, here it is. What we brand as a problem, God brands as a possibility. Okay, I still got some folk I left out in that corner over there. We see why we can. God sees why we can and why we must, because we may call it unemployment. God calls it reassignment. We call it removal, but God just calls it relocation. We see an obstacle, but God sees an opportunity that God brought you to it so God can take you through it. How many believe that today? Okay. It's the majority, but some hands didn't go up. Maybe y'all didn't hear me, so let me give you a contemporary example. Steve Harvey, that's contemporary enough for you? Steve Harvey made a major blunder when he accidentally announced that Miss Columbia was the new Miss Universe when the crown was really supposed to go to Miss Philippines. As if committing that blunder, that monumental gaffe in front of millions of viewers wasn't bad enough. Social media critics were standing ready to pounce on him. Pundits and critics all over the world began to attack him. He became the source and the basis of all types of quips and jokes and insults, even on late night television. Although he explained the error, he had owned a mistake, he apologized to the sponsors, the contestants, the viewers, and the fans, and the audience. That didn't stop a $5 million lawsuit, nor the deluge of criticism that was hurled in his direction. But Steve Harvey, being who Steve Harvey is, he was a comedian. You know he's a comedian, but he's also undaunted in his approach to life. And so he acknowledged that the dishonorable thing would have been to just leave it like it was. He was mortified by the mistake and crushed by the criticism. But I want to suggest to you today that his real life example shows us that the mistake is often the miracle if we can train ourselves to recognize it. Okay, I said that a whole lot better than I did in the first service, so you need to say amen right there. The mistake is the miracle if you can train yourself to recognize it. And here's how you do it, because in the days to follow, it was revealed that he had a contract to host that same show for at least 3 more years with the possibility of hosting it for 7, and his compensation was going to be far more than any other host had ever been paid for hosting the same show. Wait, it gets better. In addition to that, he seized the moment because of how he saw it. Say saw it. He saw to invite the contestants to discuss the mishap on his daily show, driving the ratings even higher and proving and illustrating for all of us and giving me sermon material for today to let us all know that it's not what happens to you in this life that really matters. It's what you permit to happen in you in response to what happens to you that makes all the difference. The mistake is the miracle if you can train yourself to see it that way. I got a question for you. Can you trust what you can't touch? Can you step where you can't see? Can you work on it even if you have to wait for it? Because we don't like to wait. Waiting images in our lives are mostly negative. But often before God says get up and go, God will say sit down and wait. I thank God I had to learn that. It took me 50-some years to learn it, but I thank God I finally learned that God was trying to hold me back because I wasn't ready for what God had in. I'm not by myself, am I? Waiting is not our strong suit. We don't know how to wait. We live in a microwave society. We are a FedEx mailing, fast food eating, express lane shopping kind of people. And yet sometimes before God says get up and go, he'll say sit down and wait. In fact, waiting is the hardest thing to do. It's the hardest part of trusting because we live in the adage, don't just stand there, do something. Yeah, we've been told that when we're, what you just standing there for? Make something happen. Often God is saying, don't just do something. I need you to stand there and wait till I tell you to do what you got to do. Often we want God's treasures, but we don't trust God's timing. That's a whole lot of sermons I just preached, and that just, we forget that the work God is doing in us is as important as what God is about to do for us. When we get to the crossing moments of life, y'all hear me well, we are not just waiting around, we are waiting on God. And listen, hear me when I say this, because waiting on God is much different than just waiting around. Israel waited for 40 years. The promise had been deferred for 40 years because of their disbelief. The destination is now in this text in sight, but they're delayed again, but this time by difficulty. The delay was actually defining and detailing their deliverance. What I'd preach. If you're going to get your feet wet, you have to realize that the obstacle is the opportunity. But number two, watch this. You got to realize that real expectation is revealed by rigorous preparation. Okay, y'all didn't get it. Real expectation is revealed by rigorous preparation. Because you can tell me what you're expecting all day long, but I can tell what you're expecting by what you're preparing. Are you hearing me? If you aren't preparing anything, you aren't expecting anything. Oh, I'm sorry. If you ain't, I'm trying to, let me just say it like I feel it. If you ain't preparing for nothing, you ain't expecting nothing. You have to, I told y'all sometimes you break the English, people will hear you, okay? You got to consecrate yourself today before you are blessed tomorrow. And after 3 days, when you read the text, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, when you see the Ark of the Covenant carried by the Levitical priests, you must break camp and follow it. Now, what's going on, preacher? What's all that about? Why is this piece of furniture so important that it would be required to go first? They're about to go across the Jordan, but they got this piece of furniture. And what's up with this furniture? First of all, this is no ordinary piece of furniture. This ain't something that you can get at Rooms to Go or this is not ordinary piece. This is the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant is a small rectangular box commissioned by God that carried a trio of Hebrew artifacts. Unspoiled manna from their time in the desert, Aaron's walking stick, and the precious stone tablets that had felt the engraving finger of God. Preach, Pastor. it was topped off with a heavy gold plate that was formed on the lid. At the top of the lid, it was called the mercy seat because there were two angels with outstretched wings facing and touching one another. And the Hebrews believed that when God was present in the camp, that God would be present in the place where the Ark of the Covenant was located. Y'all come here a minute, I'm going somewhere. And that God would be present in mercy and in love and in grace on the mercy seat. And so when the leader said, follow the ark, what they were really saying was follow God. That God is going to lead the way, not the soldiers, not Joshua, not the engineers and their plans, not the special forces and their weapons. When it came time to pass impassable waters, God's plan was really simply two words: trust me. And that's the same word that God is speaking to all of us right now. This year can be your best year. This is going to be the best. I wish I had somebody who could witness to that. If you just trust God. You say, Pastor, how much can I trust him? How do I trust him? You do it every day. Trust him as much as you are trusting the seat that you're sitting on. You put your whole weight in your seat without even knowing whether it could hold you or not. Trust him as much as you trust the last meal that you ate. You completely devoured that thing without even knowing who prepared it or where it came from. Trust them as much as you trust the institution, but you put that check in. It was just a check. You don't know whether they cashed it. You don't know whether it's in the bank. All you know is they gave you some statement that tells you how much you got. You ain't even seen the money. You don't know the people. You don't know their character. You don't know what they do with your money. And God says, if you can trust all that stuff that much, then what about me? I woke you up this morning. I started you on your way. I put clothes on your back. I put shoes on your feet. I put food on your table. I gave you direct TV. More y'all ought to be standing up when I said that last. God says, he says, trust me. He says, trust me. And as we gaze ahead at the challenging things that we face, that's filled with fears of words like cancer and creditors and chaos and crisis, it's so easy to fret over whether or not you can cross. Can I tell you something? None of us are exempt from faith crossings. Our lives are filled with a series of faith crossings. And for Israel and for us, the ark is a reminder that God leads us into what God promises us. God will not fail you. God will not abandon you. God will not disappoint you. All you got to do is get ready, get ready, get ready. Somebody ought to tap your neighbor and say, I'm ready to cross. I'm ready to cross. I got my cross the river shoes on. I'm through. For real, I am. Because real expectation is always revealed by rigorous preparation, and they did prepare. Can I tell you how okay, I got it. I was almost through until I thought about this part right here. Because listen, they prepared. And that's the thing. Yes, this can be your best year ever, but there has to be some preparation along with your expectation. And my question to you is, what are you preparing for across the next 11 months? You're a leader in this ministry. I'm sorry I had to go there. God has called you to do. What has God given you and put in your hands that you can envision for the next 11 months to make this year the best year ever? What is it that you are preparing for? I hear you talking about your expectation, but what about your preparation? Joshua told the people, here's how you begin. Consecrate yourself. The Hebrew word for consecrate means prepare. And it means to put yourself on spiritual high alert that God was about to do something extraordinary for them, and they didn't want to miss it by being occupied with something ordinary. I need to back that up, because that's the problem. We so bogged down with the ordinary. We so comfortable with the ordinary that we can't consecrate ourselves and wait for God to do something extraordinary. I need somebody who's in the house today right now, that you sitting on the edge of your seat because you nervous as I don't know what, because you know that there's something extraordinary about to pop off in your life, and you don't know how you're going to be able to make it happen without the help of God. We don't serve an ordinary God. We serve an extraordinary God. We serve a God that can do more than you're able to imagine, think, or ask. And here they are. They're preparing because they're expecting. I got one more thing, and I promise you I'm going to take my seat. Because here's the last thing. The smallest steps set off the mightiest miracles. Because some of y'all, okay, Pastor, how do I prepare? Just a small step. Because listen, if you want to see God move, just make a step. We have to step before we see God move. Have you heard me say this before? Faith is risky business. Without faith, listen, without risk, there can be no faith. Faith is risky business. Faith is where you function like it's already happened before it happens until it happens. Faith requires that we venture beyond our ability, that we take the step before God makes the move, because often the case that God provides no solution until you take the step. Now, compared to God's part, our part is minuscule. What you do in the process to get to where God is taking you is really small in comparison to what he does. God had promised them a land, and the current of Jordan he had promised would be stopped. But it required that they were to first take a step. What's the step? You've got to step into the water. God is ready, willing, and able to perform the miracle. But the miracle is hinged on their belief. They'd have to get their feet wet before God would act. God wants to do something amazing with your tomorrows. But it starts by your trusting God with your today. Because when I trust God, can I give you my own personal testimony? When I trust and give God generously and give to him unconditionally and give and think, oh my God, I'm giving so much. How am I going to make it? When I give and don't think about it and forgive gracefully no matter what people have done to me, the math just doesn't add up. Blessings are coming from here and blessings are coming from there, and then there go another blessing, and out of nowhere here comes it's so much coming my way I can't even say thank you. When you trust God, listen, when you trust, do I have about 10 more witnesses? I mean, seriously trust. The more I give, the more he gives to me. He supplies all my needs according to his riches in glory. And it all begins with a decision to get your feet wet. Like an electronic door, things will open up for you when you move in that direction. And that's what the people of God did. I'm through. All they did is moved in the right direction. And at the close of 3 days, there was a stirring in the Hebrew camp. A chosen band of priests robed in white began to walk towards the river. They carried the ark on acacia poles, put through those corner rings that sat on their shoulders, and the people came out of their tents and watched in hushed silence as those priests began to inch their way down to the terrace banks of the Jordan. It showed no signs of stopping. They're 30 feet away, but they're still moving towards the water. They're 20 feet now, and they still hear the rush of the water. They're 10 feet, and oh, wait, now, they're 5 feet, and it's still fast and furious, but they remembered what Joshua said. When you come to the edge of the water, I'm almost there. When you get to the edge, stand in the Jordan. And one of the things I love about Scripture is that how honest the word is, because it doesn't veil their fear. The text says when the priest got there, they dipped their feet in the water. Tap your neighbor and say, you wasn't at the first service, was you? Tell them, watch this. They got there and they dipped their feet, and they didn't cannonball into the water. They didn't do a somersault, and they didn't dive in the water. They didn't plunge. They didn't. They ever so carefully they took the tip of their toe, and it's the smallest steps. I might as well get out of both of my shoes now. It's the smallest steps that can activate the mightiest miracles, and they had to get in before they could get through, and they had to get through before they could get across, and they had to get across before they could get over, and it all started with just one step. I came to tell my church today, I'm glad you're here visiting, but you need to hear us have a conversation. I came to tell you, I dare you to make a step. Go on and tell your neighbor right now, I dare you to make a step this year. I don't know what you did in 2019, but this is your year to make a step. Because stepping into the Jordan convinced them that God was with them. And let your step this week, whatever steps you make, convince you that God is with you. And when you leave this place, you ought to leave saying, I'm glad Pastor challenged me today. He challenged me to be settled in my mind about God's love. If you don't get anything else, you ought to be settled in your mind about God's grace. He looked beyond your faults and saw your needs. You ought to be settled in your mind about God's faithfulness, because he didn't just bring you this far, he brought you all the way. Life has many unanswered questions, but God's love for you and God's ability in your life need not be one of them. You need to settle in your mind and settle it this year and join in the chorus of the confident and say, I'm convinced that nothing can separate me from the love of God. You got to get your feet wet. They took a tiny step, and as they touched their feet in the water, the Bible says the flow stopped. And it stopped as if somebody had turned off a faucet. And now you got to get this, because in verse 16 it says the place was called Zarethan. That might be something you might just read past, but let me explain what it was saying. Zarethan was 30 miles away. That God cut a 30-mile path through the river for his people to walk across. But first they had to get their feet wet. And as they stood on the western shore, they stood with no mud on their sandals, no water on their robes, and no fear in their hearts. And they could rejoice because God had done something for them that they could not do for themselves. I gotta go, y'all, but is there about 10 or 15 people in here who God has done something for that you couldn't do for? Don't fool me now. Is there anybody here that the Lord has done something for that you could not do for yourself? God not only moves in a mysterious way, God moves in a miraculous way, and they had every reason to celebrate, and so do you and I, because God has done for us what we could not do for ourselves. You ought to shout right now, let the redeemed of the Lord say so, because the past is the past and your future is real bright. God's word is sure. His work is finished. And as for Israel, their assurance came when they looked back on the Jordan. They had assurance that God was with them. We don't have to cross Jordan, but we do have something to cross. And I'm telling you today, right now, that what you can look back on is not the Jordan, but you can look back over the cross. Can I get somebody that Jesus came all the way down just to bring us all the way up? And they tell me that one Friday evening they hung him high, they stretched him wide, they dropped him low. But that's not how the story ends. He died, didn't he die? That's not how the story ends. 3 days later, wait a minute, it took 3 days before they crossed. 3 days later, after dying on the cross, he got up with all power in his hands. And I'm glad today that he took a step that we could not take. I'm glad today he died so we could live. I'm glad today because he died and because he rose. Trouble won't last always. Am I right about it? Is there anybody here that love my Jesus? Is there anybody here that love my Lord? Ain't he all right? All right. All right. Won't he make a way? Won't he? Won't he do it? Won't he will? I know he's all right. Ain't he all right? I said, ain't he all right? Ain't he all right? Ain't he all right? Find your neighbor and tell your neighbor I tried him. And I found out he's all right. He's all right. Yes, he is. Oh. I'm done. I'm through. Isn't it amazing how what we think is the problem is really our faith? Every problem you have is attached to your faith.